You are listening to the Bravo Creative Podcast, hosted by Tom Baker. Thank you for listening. Your position has been triangulated. Drone army has been dispatched to your location. Commencing attack run in 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to the Bravo Creative Podcast, and thank you so very much for listening. I've got a great show lined up for you all today, but first, some housekeeping. As usual, the Bravo Creative Podcast is being jettisoned out to you by way of Podbean, my weapon of choice, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, YouTube, and Facebook from the Bravo Creative Podcast Facebook page. And it's also linked directly from the Bravo Creative website at www.bravocreative.net/podcast. In the last few months of finding my groove with the podcast, I have had to make some adjustments and some tweaks to the process, naturally. One of those tweaks is that I am going to, and I've made the decision to move the podcast release day to Thursdays, much like today. And I apologize if that inconveniences any of my listeners, but I'm going for completion here on the project. And I found that Thursdays are a better day for my schedule, my guest schedule, and I have a better success rate when I move it to Thursdays. So Thursdays are the new release day. And I want to thank each and every one of you for sticking with me during my time of growth here at the podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by Get Out of the Box. Sometimes we just need to get out of the box and do something different. And it really does help. We, as creatives, shouldn't expect that the next great original idea to enter our brain if we do the same thing over and over again. We got to get out of the box. You got to look at it from a different perspective, inject some differing inspiration into the mix. It's scary at first, but that's what makes it fun and exciting in the end. So get out of the box and do something great. My guest today has been on my radar to join me on the show for some time. I first met my guest on set, and it immediately got my wheels in my thinking box a-turning. I wanted to talk with him about his craft, his career, his philosophy on his medium. But first, I knew I needed to get my podcast ducks in a row. So the stars have aligned, and now I get to talk with him. And I have so much to ask him, and I won't get to 10% of it today, but that's all right. I'll bring him back on. My guest has worked as a professional photographer for much of his life, having worked as a editor/photographer for USA Today in the Washington, D.C. office, to making the move to Springfield, Missouri, and working with Carbon Trace as the executive director and as a cinematographer. He has a wealth of knowledge in the field of photography. He has an amazing eye for photography. And most importantly for me, he's inspired me to get out and want to start capturing the still frame again. And I want to welcome to the microphone, Mr. Jym Wilson. Jym, I'm so glad to have you on the show today.
And I am glad to be on the show.
So I want to ask you really quick, what makes a great photographer?
Two good eyes and the ability to discern the moment.
So break that down a little bit.
Photography is about a lot of things, but ultimately it's about light. And when the light is the best moment to take the picture is so crucial. There's as many types of photography as there are photographers practically. One of the things I really have enjoyed about my background in photojournalism is photojournalists are chameleons. They wear a lot of hats. They can go from spot news to portrait photography to sports photography to feature photography to scenic photography. within that, the one commonality is light. Finding the light that's going to fall on your subject in the best way to make the best picture. If you're shooting sports, finding the light that's going to enable you to stop motion, if that's what you have to do.
So is that, and I don't know if I'm the only one that feels this way, but over the years, it's gotten to the point that it's all I look at. Like, I'm constantly looking at how light hits, how the different types of light. Like right now, and if you don't know, we're on the road and I'm in Jim's lovely, peaceful office, and there's like light coming in from the window here. There's a light behind you. It's very pleasing. And you look at it and go, man, I'd love to be able to take a photograph of this right now. Do you look at things like that all the time? Have you become, I guess, not obsessed with it, but just kind of comfortable looking at things like that?
I'm definitely comfortable. I wouldn't say that I'm obsessed. It is second nature to look at light. Sometimes you walk into a room and the first thing you think is, where's the best light in this room? Even if you're not going to take pictures, because, and we can talk about this more later, because of iPhones, everybody has a camera all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Which means if I am walking into a room and I don't have a quote unquote real camera, I want to know where I need to be if I want to take a picture of the family, of the nieces, that type of thing. But light is an obsession. And
are you a light snob?
No.
So like if you came into this room when you first purchased the house and it had a fluorescent light, would you turn that fluorescent light on?
No.
So you're a little bit of a light snob then.
Well, okay. So here's the thing. I can begin to date myself, because I'm sure we'll talk about that today, by saying that when I first got started in photography, to take a color picture, the light pretty much had to be perfect. It had to be daylight, or else you had to fill in with some sort of artificial light, or use a filter to filter out artificial light,
right,
like a fluorescent light, or the color would be really funky. So now you can walk into almost any situation, including very, very low light situations, and make some camera adjustments and have it look like it was taken in broad daylight, with perfectly balanced, light coming in, filling the room. Or conversely, you can make it look like it was taken in tungsten light when you in fact were outdoors.
Oh, yeah.
Or you can make it look like it's very, very dark in the room just by underexposing, which you always have been able to do. But now it's almost a little bit easier to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a ton easier. Huh?
Yeah.
It's like, you look at I was doing some just little photographs out in the yard of some flowers at I don't know, it was the sun was down, and I got just a little LED light and was able to do some like what we used to do, where you'd basically stop it down all the way and then introduce a flash into it and do like daytime flash photography. Mm-hmm. Now you can do it at night with a little LED light, and it's so much easier.
Well, or you can go the other way. Last week I went to our neighbor and friend Vicky Trippy's house, because she's an amazing gardener, and she had told me that her columbine were peaking. And I went at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, and I underexposed almost every photograph so that the background would go away.
Oh, yeah.
It was like I'd taken the photos in a studio with a black backdrop and all that sort of stuff. And all I was really doing was following that old slide exposure
Actually,
rule.
you posted those, didn't you?
Yeah,
I saw those.
Yeah.
Those look great.
Yeah, but it's the old expose for the highlights, let the shadows fall where they may rule of thumb of transparency photography.
So when did you get your start in photography? How old were you?
I can trace my earliest appreciation of photography to being like 8 or 9 or 10 years old, through two things. Life magazine was coming into the house every day or every week. Life magazine at the time was the pinnacle of photojournalism. In the 60s, of course, the Vietnam War was going on and tremendous photography was being done there. The other thing was my parents were pretty good snap shooters, nothing but snapshots, family pictures, vacations, things like that. And one of my little responsibilities in the summer was to get on my bike and ride down to the corner drugstore and pick up that roll of film. So I was the first one to get to see the photos, after they'd been processed. And that has really stuck in my mind for a long time. By the time I was in junior high school, I was taking pictures for the high school or for the school paper. Same thing in high school, school paper, school yearbook. And I went to work at the local newspaper shortly after I got out of high school.
That's awesome. It's weird because that's how I got into it. Mine was a little bit different. It wasn't Life magazine. It was album covers. My dad had, a ton of album covers, and I would just sit down on the ground, and Dad, he would be playing, and I would pull up an album cover, and it actually kind of hodgepodged into graphic design too, because there were so many cool designs back then. Mid 70s, going through and looking at those in the photography, and and my dad was a great snapshot shooter as well. He had a little Pentax ME, and then he gave it to me whenever I joined the yearbook club, and that was kind of my inception into it.
Yeah, to this day, I still love square photographs, and just beside us in this room are probably 1,500 or 2,000 albums, and like my friend Jerry, I can look at the end of the album and picture the cover and know what the album is. I don't have to pull the album out some of the time.
Out of all those, which one's your favorite?
What day is it? That would be a tough call, but I would probably have to say Born to Run by Springsteen.
Yeah. I've got that one hanging on my wall downstairs. Yeah.
Good choice. Yeah. Eric Miola, by the way, who took the cover of the cover photograph of Springsteen and Clarence Clemens, is an excellent photographer and has a tremendous book of storm photographs that were taken here in the Midwest.
Really?
He went out with storm chasers for years, and his obsession began shooting some photos for Springsteen on a road trip, and the book came out 2 years ago, and I think it's behind you somewhere. It'd be in the M's. But anyway, Eric Miola is a terrific photographer.
So, and I have to say that the reason you can judge a book by its cover or an album cover by its cover, because some of them, I like the album because I loved looking at the cover. Yeah. It's like that one, and was it Eric Clapton's Slow Hand? Yeah. It's just a simple black and white image, but I always was gravitating to the black and white images. Yeah. Did you kind of start out as a black and white photographer, or were you just kind of whatever I could get my hands on to film?
Yeah, it was primarily black and white. I do want to digress for a second, and that is just to say that album covers are the reason I love square photographs. Okay. And we can talk about that more, but I just have always really liked square photos, and finally got my first square format film camera about a month ago, when a friend of mine sent me his Yashica Mat 124G, which is a classic camera. And I haven't even put a roll of film through it, but as you can see, there's a box of film next to it. Oh, yeah. And I'm just waiting for the right day. I've got a project in mind for that.
I've got the Mamiya C220.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Same thing.
Great
yeah,
little
well, not
square.
Same thing. Yeah, that's a better camera. And I've managed to digress away from your question.
That's all right. The Bravo podcast, we digress all the time, so it's totally
so
fine.
I've heard. So your question, can you remember it?
Let's see, what was it? Oh, black and white.
Black and white
photography.
Yeah. Okay. So the first camera that I remember actually owning was a Polaroid Swinger, I think, which was this funky little camera that had a film pack, and you could focus it sort of, and you pulled the photos out one at a time after you took them, and then you let them process behind the secret panel or whatever, secret piece of paper, and then you would peel it apart, and there was the image, and you had this funny little pink sponge roller that you fixed the image with. And it smelled like vinegar, because the base of vinegar, or the base of fixer,
right,
is a vinegar, is an acid of some sort. Anyway, that used black and white. So in this house, there are actually some of the very first photos that I remember taking.
Really?
Yeah. When I actually started getting more interested in it, more serious about it, was in high school. I got that first camera. I actually found that camera, believe it or not. It's a Kodak Retina 1A. It's a 35 millimeter camera. I joined the high school camera club in South Burlington, Vermont. That was led by Tom Sargent. Thank you, Mr. Sargent, if you're still out there. He was the advisor. And I joined in my freshman year. And sophomore, junior, and senior year, I was one of the co-presidents of the camera club. And we would have people come in and give us lessons in printing. And I was shooting black and white Tri-X that we were loading with a little bulk loader. You'd buy like 100 feet of film, and you'd buy these really crappy cartridges that you would put 36 exposures in. And the reason the cartridges were crappy is because the felt would trap grit, and every frame would get scratched as it went through the camera. But from there, I
did not know that.
Yeah, it was you could buy 100-foot rolls of color film as well, and there was a Nikon 250 exposure back that fit on a Nikon F, and maybe they made one for an F2 that the early rocket launches were shot with, because obviously the photographers had to set their cameras up on tripods off in a swamp, and they would have some sort of a remote release, and it wasn't like you could shoot 36 and go change film. You had to like push the button while the rocket took off.
Were they doing like multiple exposures then, like with a motor mount?
It was like probably 2.5 or 3 frames a second. And most cameras today, most good amateur to serious amateur to professional cameras are shooting anywhere between 6 and 14 frames per second.
Yeah.
These guys were shooting 2.5 to 3.5 frames per second on a 250 exposure roll, and they would just like as soon as the launch announcer would hit zero blast off, they would hit zero blast off, they would hit their shutter release, so they get that big plume of smoke and the flames, and then and they of course were doing that with a remote trigger of some sort, and then also shooting with a handheld camera. I only know this from seeing photos of how it was done and seeing photos of the press corps back during those early Mercury launches.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing, you went back to what got me interested. Life magazine also covered the space race very closely. And so there were very cool photos.
I've always wanted to have one of the moon cameras.
Yeah. One of my great pleasures in my career was meeting John Glenn when he was a U.S. Senator and photographing him with his space capsule.
Really?
Yeah, it's a very funny story. We right now, you and I, are doing that wonderful thing that is the equivalent of dancing about architecture. We are talking on a podcast about photographs, so we're going to have to be really descriptive here, Tom, about what it is. But meeting the senator was kind of a thrill, because there we are at the Smithsonian, and he's standing next to his space capsule and being very funny and being very charming, and immediately surrounded by kids. A tour going through the Air and Space Museum, and the curator who was our guide said this happens every time he comes, and he's always wonderful with the kids, because
that is so cool.
He knows he might be talking to a future astronaut.
Wow.
Yeah.
That would be, that's just, and honestly, I wasn't around for any of that, but The Right Stuff was one of my favorite films growing up, and it was one of those films that it just brought a lot of those people to life.
Yeah.
And it was such a great film.
Oh yeah.
In and of itself. It had never been done in that scale before, and it was so good.
Yeah. Oh, I watch that film once or twice a year. I've read the book by Tom Wolfe. And there are parts of that movie that are magic. Sam Shepard is
that opening sequence. I'm sorry, that's one of my favorite opening sequences of a movie. Is when he breaks the sound barrier, and then he comes walking out of the desert, and you're just like, that is so cool.
Loan me a piece of Beeman's.
Beeman's.
And his sidekick there is, of course, Levon Helm, the great
drummer from the band. Yeah. If I have a third kid, I'm naming my third child after Levon Helms.
You could do far worse. But you couldn't do much better.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Levon Helms it's so crazy. I didn't even think about that. But Levon Helms is one of my favorite musicians.
Great singer, great drummer, heck of a mandolin player.
Oh yeah, and he's from not too far from here.
Yeah, and there's somebody here in Springfield who I met recently who said that they worked with a bartender who was also his hospice care attendant or something. I mean, one of those really weird things.
Really?
Yeah. Anyway.
That's crazy.
Yep.
So you got into photography. When did you decide that that was what you were going to do for the rest of your life? Most of the rest of your life, because
Sure.
you kind of went a couple different directions for a little bit.
Yeah, I did, for sure. I got real serious about photography my junior or senior year in high school. And my senior year in high school, when we were all encouraged to apply for colleges, I applied to two. I applied to the Rochester Institute of Technology, which was at the time considered the best technical school for photography in the country. And I also applied to Boston University as a journalism student. Got into BU, got waitlisted at RIT, and had zero money and zero plans on how to get any money. So I took a year off to make some money so that I could go to BU, where I would have been a journalism major, and who knows where that would have taken me. And instead, at the job that one of the jobs that I took after high school, I connected with people at the local paper on an even deeper level. I already had a little bit of a relationship and got hired as a 2-day-a-week lab technician. And for everybody born in this century and most of the last century, the end of the last century, a lab technician was the person who took film into a completely dark room and put it in chemicals to create negatives, which then were put into an enlarger that were then projected onto pieces of light-sensitive paper and turned into prints. That's a pretty good, concise description.
It's very good.
Yeah, I'm proud.
Almost sound like a professional.
Yeah. I have played one on TV more than once. Anyway, yeah.
Did you get an appreciation from photography from working in the darkroom?
Yeah, and on two levels. I got an appreciation for good photography and bad photography because as a lab technician, I was processing and printing other people's film. It was a small department. There were only, I think, 4 staff photographers and 2 lab technicians. The lab technicians also took photographs because there would be times when we were shorthanded and we would go out. My appreciation actually for good photographs, good photographers actually did begin when I was in high school, though, because I subscribed to both Modern and Popular Photography, which were magazines at the time that were known affectionately as mom and pop photography. And they carried...
I still have some of those old issues that my parents would find at a garage sale, and they would bring them home.
Yeah, I might have one or two around somewhere. Yeah. I also had an uncle who was a very good amateur photographer and in North Carolina. And so when I would go to visit him, he would show me books and things like that and give me some hints. But the 2 magazines that would do profiles on sort of both early photographers, some of the sort of groundbreaking first photographers in the history of the art, as well as guys like Gene Smith and Pete Turner, folks like that, and they would feature their photographs. So that was like the high bar. These were the guys that were really great. And then I'm at this.
And those were more like the art photographers.
Yeah,
correct.
Pete Turner for sure. Gene Smith, however, was the sort of so-called father of photojournalism.
Photojournalism,
yeah. And it would be interesting to see his work presented today, either to see what he would be doing with digital photography, as well as for him to sort of try to be selling the work that he did, because he was heavy on manipulation, which is, of course, in photojournalism now considered a no-no. As an aside, there's a movie coming out starring Johnny Depp called Minamata, it's about one of Smith's last major projects, and it's filmed in Japan, and it was about victims of mercury poisoning.
Oh, that's right, because he was actually kind of one of the people that started all the photo essays, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct, yeah.
And so he was one that he kind of got in trouble for that, didn't he?
Well,
from the Japanese government? Right?
Yeah, the book is right over there, and it's just called Minamata, and he did it with his wife, who was also Japanese. And she took some of the photos, including photos that she took of him while he was being beaten by the goons of the company that was dumping mercury into the water source for the people in this small. I don't want to call it a village. It might have been a small city. I don't remember precisely. Anyway, movie starring Johnny Depp. Hopefully will come to the U.S. It's already premiered in Europe a little bit, but because of various reasons, it hasn't opened in the States yet.
Really?
Yeah. And I am Facebook friends with Smith's son, Kevin Eugene. Never have actually met him, but we've had some nice exchanges about both his dad's influence on me and every photojournalist
right.
my age. And
now he got fired too from, was it the Washington
Life magazine?
Life magazine, because he wouldn't use was it a medium format camera?
Well, they didn't appreciate that. Smith was famous for being fired. He was a speed freak and an alcoholic, which was how he managed to be so productive, because he would go into the darkroom and print for literally days, just ramped up on speed. But he took on a project for somebody about the city of Pittsburgh, and it was supposed to take a month or something like that.
It took him like 3 years.
He was there for 2 or 3 years, produced 5,000 work prints. It was just insane. He's definitely legendary within the photojournalism community, as both sort of a kids don't try this at home, but kids be just like him school of thought.
Yeah.
Yeah, the very first time I ever went to New York City, I went to a gallery that represented Smith, and there was among many other photographers, and there was a wicker basket on the floor in the corner of this gallery, and there were prints by Smith's printer, which meant that they were like one generation removed from him. He would have approved them for sale, and they were like $75. And I was 19 or 20 years old and did not have $75. I did not have a credit card. And today a print like that would be worth, thousands. But, it was nice to just be able to pick them up and hold them.
Oh, yeah. It's a great story, too. You got that, I guess.
I got that. And actually, somewhere in this room, there is a Smith print that I bought from Magnum earlier this year. They do this special once a year, and it was like $100 for a 4-inch by 4-inch print, and it's from one of his photo essays, the nurse midwife piece.
Oh wow!
That's a wonderful story. Yeah.
Now they made all of them are pretty much books now, though, right? You can get a book of all of his, well, at least the ones that he approved. You can get books for a lot of those, can't you?
Yeah. Well, I'm looking from here, and let's see where we go to Smith. I've got at least 6 Smith books over there. There's 2 biographies up there. And then there is a book that was called The Big Black Book or something like that, which was one of his last pieces of work that was sort of an overview of his entire career. When he died in Tucson, I think it was, at the University of Arizona, he had just moved out there and was supposed to be their photojournalism professor. And he had lived a very hard life and had a stroke and died. Interestingly, he had this stroke while looking for one of his cats that had run away, and he was in a grocery store when he collapsed. It's just tragic. He also had not only been beaten while trying to cover the story in Minamata, but had been badly injured during an explosion or a bombing on an island in the Pacific.
Oh, that's right. He was
during World War II.
Island hopping with the United States Army, wasn't
Correct.
he?
Yeah,
the Marines,
and took some of his best, some of the best early war photographs after the Civil War, were Gene Smith's. But he actually took a photo of the explosion that nearly killed him. And for people who are real familiar with photographs, if you've ever seen the photo of the 2 little kids walking into a garden, holding hands with beautiful light, and it's a black and white photo, and it's called Walk to Paradise Garden, and it's the first picture he took after months and months of recovery. Side note.
Yeah, because he got hit with quite a bit of shrapnel, didn't he?
Correct.
And then later on in life, when he got beat up, messed his eyes up, or messed up one of his eyes, or something like that.
Yeah. So he was an incredibly diverse photographer, and obviously had an influence on me. But then, I can look over at the books over here, and there's Sebastião Salgado, who I think is still probably the greatest working photographer today. There's Annie Leibovitz, who lots and lots of people know for her commercial work. Her early work for Rolling Stone was fabulous. And every now and then she'll slip into a personal project and sort of reveal her heart. I got to interview her for USA Today for a video interview, and it was really a pleasure to meet her.
That is cool.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a good time.
So who is the most famous person you've ever met? Because you've photographed quite a few people.
Yeah. There's this actor in Springfield named Tom Baker.
Oh, yeah.
He's awesome.
I didn't make it into your top photos of 2020, though.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Jonna Voles almost made it in.
That was a good shot, too, of her. Yeah. Well, we probably should go back just a quick, since we kind of punted that up there. So the way that I met you is you were working. Carbon Trace was hired to work kind of in a documentary standpoint for the Land of Milk and Honey, and you were there. You weren't there the first day.
Wasn't there the first day. I think I was there for 5 days off and on, and I was sort of what we call camera B, meaning I was trying to shoot pickup for the documentary work that we were doing. It's basically a behind the scenes thing, as well as some other, potential projects that we're still hashing out. But I also was making a lot of still photographs. I am working on on documentary film now, and learning every time I go out, but I cannot resist taking stills. And fortunately, the DSLRs that we use today also are very good at making stills, or are primarily for taking stills, making stills. So I did make a lot of stills on set. There were some characters that just had to be photographed.
Your images from that were beautiful.
Thank you.
And and the thing that was cool about it is, being someone that's usually behind the camera, that experience of being in front of the camera and having a photographer roaming around and taking photographs of you. I don't remember you ever taking like 95% of those photographs, because
well,
you're really elusive.
I could say a couple things about that. Photojournalists like to think of themselves as being a fly on the wall. And in fact, some people think of all photojournalists as being paparazzi, which is totally a misnomer and totally a slander on good photojournalists. But paparazzi, it translates in Italian to something like buzzing fly or something like that, because they're always around, always hovering. But good photojournalists try to not be part of the story, try to not be noticed. It is becomes so much easier with digital cameras, mirrorless cameras, because there's no mirror slap, there's no shutter noise. So I can have the camera up to my eye from the minute I walk on set, and I could be taking pictures all day long and nobody would know. And that's exactly what I was doing. And I had the camera in silent mode on top of that, which means it was even quieter. And you guys were all really focused on everything but me. You're focusing on your performance. You're focusing on your co-stars' performance, so that you're working off of each other and working with each other. You're kind of aware of what the director has told you to do. You got to know where your light is. I mean, it all comes back to light again.
Yeah.
Am I in my light? Am I out of my light? And where's the camera? All that sort of stuff. So I think part of the reason the photos were so successful was that I was like the least of anybody's concerns. It
is true. There was a fear factor, and the photographer was the least of that fear factor there.
Yeah. I'm in some ways in a situation like that, you kind of want to be like the family photographer, the guy that's just, Uncle Jim's here and he's taking pictures of us again, and he's always got his camera. We mentioned Bruce Springsteen earlier, and I got a number of good photo books that are collections of photos of him. And there's one by a guy named Dave Garr, and David passed several years ago, but his photos are completely different than anybody else's, because it looks just like that. Oh, Uncle Dave's here. Let's just all do some family photos. And then, he keeps working, and all of a sudden everybody's forgotten he's there. He was a character. I ran into him a couple of times in Newport at the folk festival, and actually got into a little bit of a shoving match with him, which was really kind of funny at the time, because here I was like 30 years old, and I'm in a shoving match with a guy who's the age that I am now. And I'm kind of embarrassed by that, but I think that he actually respected me a little bit for like not yielding ground. And it was absurd, because it was like the difference between being, one place or being, 6 inches on the other side of that. It's just,
so you guys were like vying for a spot to shoot.
And I think we were like I think the two of us were among 4 or 5 photographers. So there was plenty of room. It was just like, I want to be here. No, I want to be here. It's a little bit of, macho posture. He's a very good photographer. underappreciated, and a part of that is because he was a real curmudgeon, and it was hard for him to get gallery work.
Really?
Yeah, my understanding is that his estate is now with like a convent or something like that, or there's some charity that benefits from any sale of it. There's a gallery that represents him, but the money all goes to some charity.
So I want to switch gears real quick.
Sure.
I want to go back into, because we're kind of talking about gear. What is your favorite focal length?
Oh wow! And what's my favorite? Record album, and what's my favorite song? What day is it, and what's the light out? For years I love Nikon's Nikkor 180 millimeter f2.8. That's just the sweetest lens in the world. It's great for portraits. It's good for news. It's good for sports.
It allowed you to be a fly on the wall for a lot of it.
A fly on the wall. Now almost everything is zoom lenses, and even though I don't own one, I used for years during my career either a 70 to 200 or an 80 to 200 f2.8 zoom, and not having one of those right now is sort of like walking around without my left arm. It's really hard. I do a lot of nature photography, and I do that with a 150 to 600 millimeter Tamron lens. But
is that a good lens?
It's an extraordinary lens. It really is.
Back in the day, Tamron was like kind of a junk lens.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to be, but when I first got my first lens, I was like, I'll get a Tamron because I can't afford a Nikon.
Sure.
So I got a Tamron. It was a 28. It was a 28 to 70, I think.
Yeah.
And it was a 2.8, and I thought, you know what? And so I started my first little business with that, 2870, and it was a great lens. I had it forever, but it was kind of soft in certain places and but nowadays you look at there's a Tamron that I'm looking at now. It's a 17 to 28, wide open, like 2.8. That thing is still tack sharp.
Yeah.
It's crazy, and from edge to edge.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is undoubtedly because of computer optic design. It used to be that you had these, geniuses that would sit down and sketch out, and then, they would carefully hand polish and everything. And now it's all done through computer programs, and the computer cuts the glass, and it's, et cetera, et cetera. So it's much easier for a Tamron to compete with a Nikon. I know that if I could afford a Nikkor, I think they're equivalent. It's like the 200 to 500 or 200 to 600. I would probably take a look at it, but it's at least twice, if not three times the price of the Tamron 150 to 600. Yeah. One of my first jobs involving photography that paid money was selling cameras in the camera department at a department store in South Burlington, Vermont. The store was called Gaines. Lots and lots of fun stories about Gaines, but end of the day, there was Tamron and Solagor and Vivitar. Those were all the off brands. And then you had the brands that, or the lenses that were made by the camera manufacturers. And yeah, those early ones were really pretty crappy. They fell apart really easily. You'd shake them and you'd hear the elements hitting each other and you'd go, oh, this is not one I want to own. I've been really fortunate in that most of my career, my equipment was supplied by the companies that I was working for. I owned a fair amount of gear, but I never was lacking for gear. And even when I was working as a photo editor at USA Today, after 9/11, all the photo editors were issued gear because we were in sort of an unfortunate situation that day of having to run to the equipment locker, those of us who were editors, to run to the equipment locker to pull gear out because we were within eyesight of the Pentagon, which of course meant we were also in eyesight of the Capitol. And we needed to gear up really fast. Anyway, they issued camera equipment. So.
And a lot of people don't realize this, probably that are born within the last however many years, was that there were no camera phones on 9/11.
Good point.
There were no video cameras on phones. It was, if you captured video of it, it was because you had a bona fide VH, little camcorder. None of the cameras had video cameras on them, even back then. You were lucky to even have a digital camera then.
Yeah, when I went to the equipment locker,
Kodak had one out. Kodak, they had that big, I don't remember what it was called, but Kodak had that really big. It was like one of the first DSLRs.
Yeah.
had come out then, and then Sony had those little floppy disk drive,
The Mavica.
the Mavicas. Yeah.
That was actually a couple of years before. Nikon had upgraded. Nikon and Kodak did partner up, and I had one of those. It was a DCS3, I think, and it was like carrying a Nikon F2 that then had a brick welded onto the bottom. It was just incredibly heavy. Didn't take the color was completely. It was like you were making a pastel painting every time you took a photograph. It just took a huge amount of time in
So it was
Photoshop.
blurry.
Nah, it was, like I said, it was like a watercolor or a pastel. But it was, if you were in a hurry. Now on 9/11, there actually were better cameras by then. I have photos that I took on both Nikon cameras, digital cameras, and,
really?
and film cameras.
So
yeah, for sure.
Was it the 1DX or whatever that was? That
I
came out?
sort of stopped paying
It's
attention.
so weird that is so distant. But yeah, that was what, 20?
We're coming
Yeah.
up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, 2001. So
Yeah, it was the year I got married. Actually, my wife and I are having our 20th anniversary.
there you go. Yeah, it's yeah, exactly. It's 20 years this September.
Wow. Yeah.
So
And you were in Washington, D.C. when that happened, correct?
Yeah. We moved to Washington, D.C. in 1993. I took a job with Gannett News Service, which was the wire service that supplied photos for all the Gannett papers. Gannett also, of course, owned and started and owned USA Today. And around 97, I think it was, I moved from the wire service, where I was a photographer who covered the Hill and the White House and some other stuff. I moved to USA Today, where I became a photo editor and worked in the life section. And
It's my favorite section. That was my favorite section.
Yeah, it was mine too.
Every time I would go and get the USA Today, I would throw everything else away and I would go to the life section.
The purple section.
Yeah, it was the purple section.
Yeah, and I was really lucky because I was there during the heyday of the section when we grew from a certain size to a bigger size, and on Fridays we were a double section, and anyway, I was there, and my specialty was entertainment coverage, including award shows. But
I used to go to McDonald's on Fridays because I could go and I could read the life section, and because they always had one there, and I'd always go in, and that's where I'd...
Yeah. USA Today was great for circulation because it got passed along so much. The pass along is, if you subscribe to a paper, it used to be considered like, maybe 1.5 persons read each edition, each copy of every edition. So if you sold 40,000, your pass along circulation was 60,000. Our circulation, we got close to 2.5 million or something like that. And because people would leave it behind in restaurants, and particularly at the gate in
airports,
airports, some sections would get read like 3 or 4 times.
The tangible aesthetic of a USA Today paper, in my opinion, is the reason why it was in color, and really nobody else was really doing that. Mm-hmm. Maybe the Post was.
Well, lots and lots of Gannett papers were doing color, but they weren't doing it every day, and they weren't doing it inside as well as on the section fronts. When I left Burlington,
it just popped when you look at
but
it. It was like,
their
this is
standard
going to
was
be
very, very high.
This is going to be enjoyable to read. Yeah.
Their standard was very, very high, and the design of the paper was very specific and followed very set rules that were in place from the time it started until there was I think it only went through 2 major redesigns in the first 40 years of edition. And now, unfortunately, like most newspapers, it's pretty much a shadow of its former self in the print edition.
Yeah, there were so many I loved. I read it anytime I could. It was like one of those things that I would just stop and...
Yeah. It, both the writing and the photography was special and unique, and ridiculed and then admired. When it was first released, people just said, this is a joke. This is never going to succeed. And suddenly we were like as big as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, which are the 2 biggest circulation papers in the country.
So when you started there, did you have an idea or an inkling that it was going to be big?
Well, it already was big. I started there in, like I said, in around 97. The paper started in 82. So it had been in existence for 15 years. When USA Today first started, they had what they called the loaner program, where they borrowed staff from all the Gannett papers around the country. And they would borrow that staff for 3-month shifts. So you were a loaner for 3 months. And I went twice. I went once in 87 and again in 92, which is sort of what put me on their radar, and also put me on GNS's radar. So when I got hired as a photo editor at USA Today, rather than the size of the paper, my biggest concern is what's it going to be like not taking photographs every day? Because, I just went from taking photos every day, covering the Hill, covering the White House, which was very, very exciting, to working for a paper that I had wanted to work for pretty much since 1982 when it first started, because I'd had former colleagues who said, you really should be applying. You should really come here. The photographers that I worked with at USA Today who were on staff were and are, because a few of them are still there, some of the best photographers in the country to my way of thinking, at least in terms of newspaper photographers. Incredibly diverse, incredibly hardworking, incredibly talented. And to not be making pictures every day was a very big change for me. And I can remember like thinking, God, I haven't taken a picture all week. That was strange.
Really?
And I did have a couple of opportunities early in my time there to do a couple of photo projects. I went to Africa for 3 weeks for an AIDS in Africa project, because the photographer who was going to go got sick, and it was just considered not a good idea for her to go to work on an AIDS in Africa project, having just gotten over like bronchial pneumonia or something like that. But for whatever it was, 18 years, I was a photo editor first and a photographer second. And my personal work definitely got put aside as a result of that. But I got very, very good at photo editing. And I got very good at organizing and at working with photographers.
You got to where it only took you 2 hours to edit a photo.
No, actually, it's funny that you should say that, because I covered a lot of award shows, and the biggest show that I covered was the Academy Awards, and I did that 15 years in a row. And by the time the last couple of years I did that, we were using a technique called tethering, where the cameras are directly tied into laptop computers that you're editing on. And so we would look at like 5,000 photographs at least in the course of a night, and be trying to choose the absolute best of those. Now, the Academy Awards, I would have 2 or 3 other editors working with me. But if you're at the CMA Awards, Country Music Association Awards, or I think the Grammys, I did with alone a couple of times, and with one other editor a couple of times. But it's just drinking out of the fire hose, It's just like, oh my God, I hope I'm choosing the right ones. But as a photo editor, you get really good at selecting the best ones quickly. I had a boss at USA Today who, when we actually interviewed him, it was a funny process. We interviewed him to become the director of photography, and I asked him what his philosophy of photo editing was, and he said, choose the best one and run it big. You're hired. I mean, he's got my boat, man. That works for me. And now that I'm back to doing my own work. I mean, it's really, that's in the back of my mind. A lot of times it's like, what's the one I want to see big?
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, which is the one that you really want that you could imagine on the wall looking, that you could look at every day too. Yep.
What's a magazine cover? What's worth hanging in a gallery? What's something that you would look at 20 inches by 30 inches rather than, 4 inches by 6 inches and feel good about it?
That brings up, it's kind of one of the things that I've talked about on the podcast a lot, is that we get a lot better at what we're doing when we surround ourselves with people that are really good at what they do. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because by being with USA Today and working with a ton of professional and very probably competent photographers, you probably had to learn pretty quick just to be able to tread water in that field.
I felt very confident about my own abilities as a photographer and at editing my own photographs. So my biggest fear is a strong word. My biggest concern was looking at somebody else's pictures and choosing the wrong one, or choosing the one that they thought was the wrong one. But I developed a reputation among all of the photographers that I worked with as being a photographer's photo editor, meaning I understood the challenges that they faced every time they walked into an assignment, and that I knew what was going to look good in print. It might not be the absolute best photograph if you were going to have a gallery, or if it was going to be a resume, type of picture, portfolio photo. But it was the one that was going to be the right one for publication. So there was that. I worked with more than dozens, fewer than hundreds of photographers over the 18 years. I would define them three ways. There were what I called the ham and eggers, and a ham and egger you could hire him. The photo would be in focus, it would be properly exposed, and if you looked long enough, you would find a good picture, that you could publish. And some of them were challenging because they knew they were not very good. Some of them were challenging because they thought they were really good. Then there were the photographers who were talented, and there were lots and lots of talented photographers. They were really hardworking. They could light. They could create a mood. They could create an atmosphere with their subject if it was a portrait. And so those were the people who I worked with the absolute most. And they were a joy. Some of them, one of my closest friends at the time was a guy that I described as being like a brother to me, because we fought all the time. But man, when I saw him for the first time after 2 years after leaving the paper, it was like one of the best hugs I've ever got, just because we had missed each other so much.
Why is that, you think?
We had so much fun, so many adventures. And, I think photographers understand that photo editors put them in situations to make good pictures, and their name goes underneath the photo, just like the subject does. In other words, if the photo says, if it's a portrait of Bruce Springsteen, and underneath it also says photo by Robert Deutsch, USA Today, he knows that I'm the one that arranged for Robert Deutsch to be in the space with Bruce, which did happen. You're welcome, Bob. I to this day regret not jumping on the train and going up to assist on that one. But anyway, the third level of photographer were the gifted. And I think that in my 18 years, I might have worked with a half a dozen gifted photographers. They were the ones who could not only take a picture of anything, but I would typically give them no direction other than to say, this is where you have to be and this is when. Or I'm hiring you because you took a picture that I really loved and this is it, and I need something that has that mood to it, and you're the only person.
So they're kind of on another level, and they're always photographing.
Yeah. And a lot of them are either really busy because they're so good, or they're not, or they're always available because they're so good that it's hard for other people to work with them. Yeah. And I don't mean because they're difficult. I just mean they don't know what to do with these guys. And it's,
some of them can be, though. I mean, that is part of their kind of MO. I mean, heck, you see it so much. I mean, I'm sure you see it everywhere, but I've noticed it more even like, just being in the creative fields. I work with someone that is a outstanding actor, and there's gonna be something different about them. It's not that it's bad, it's not that it's good, it's just different. Yeah. And it's because I think there's always gonna be a deficiency of either personality to compensate for that amazing art form that they're able to, their head is somewhere else in a lot of cases.
So I was covering a protest outside the White House. I think it was in '87. Reagan was the president at the time, and Gorbachev was visiting, and the Russians had occupied Afghanistan. And there was a protest outside the White House by Afghanis. And I'm making pictures of the protesters and whatnot, and I look, and there's a guy next to me, and he's got this big head of hair and headphones. And I said, man, what are you listening to? Thinking that it was going to be like, Bob Marley or whatever. And he said, NPR. I want to know what's going on in there. And then I looked again, and it was David Burnett. Well, David Burnett is like one of the greatest photographers of his generation. And he's been around for like 60 years, I want to say. He's almost 80. And David is to this day making great photographs. But I said to myself, I'm in the right place because I'm standing next to David Burnett. And that's, I've had this conversation with colleagues at USA Today that, sometimes you go into stuff for the first time or two and you go, what am I doing here? I'm standing next to one of my heroes. And then you go, I'm here because I deserve to be here. The gifted ones, sometimes you don't want them to be with anybody else. You want to send them in, when there's no other photographers around. You just have to kind of game up to be ready to have hard conversations with them, or be, willing to just like, okay, I got to call this person. I'm going to get myself a cup of coffee and turn my back to the room because I know this is going to be a long time on the phone.
Right.
But then, I can remember working with a really gifted photographer one time at an event, and the first pictures showed up from the event, and I looked at it and I went, oh, everything else is gravy. Nailed it on the first shipment of photos.
Kind of takes the pressure off.
Or makes the next round of photos even, like what's he going to do next?
Right.
That type of thing.
When you're talking about your career or walk, is you were a photographer, you moved into an editor, you've moved to Springfield. Now you're doing what?
Well, now I'm making pictures for myself again, which is a real change. And that was something that took me about 2 years to get to after leaving USA Today. I left USA Today in 2015. I took a buyout offer, and that gave me a year and a half to just sort of regroup. USA Today had become like watching the movie Groundhog Day, except for I wasn't learning French. So I had a year and a half to I had a year that I was paid, and I managed to stretch that to a year and a half. And then after 2 years, the cats wouldn't get jobs and the mortgage wouldn't pay itself. So I took a job at a hardware store. And while I was at the hardware store, I was walking around with my iPhone and, on my breaks and little walks to and from work or whatever. And I started making pictures, and I'd also bought a little Sony A6000 digital camera. And I realized that I was taking pictures for me again. And that's the one thing about working at a newspaper is you're taking pictures for an audience. They are personal to some extent, but you always are trying to communicate to somebody else. And the pictures that I take now start out for me first. I'm the audience. If nobody else likes them, I don't care. If I like it, that's good enough. But if other people like it, that's gravy. When you're working as a photojournalist, if other people don't like your photos, you don't get hired or you get fired. So now I'm taking pictures here in Springfield, a lot of bird photography lately because it's been spring and there's been good birds. And also because during the pandemic, couldn't get out and take pictures of photos, of people, couldn't get out and explore Missouri as much as I wanted to. But I am involved through Carbon Trace Productions. We did a pre-production project for MSU, visiting Shannon County, which is the second poorest county in Springfield, in Missouri, I think, to work on a follow-up film for a movie that was made 40 years ago, a documentary film. And working as a cinematographer on that, but doing a lot of portrait photography. So it's sort of full circle, but also personal.
I've never really talked about this, but this is, now that I'm sitting across from you, it begs the question is like, I got to a point in photography, doing portraits, that it always felt like I was doing stuff just to feed the monkey. Mm-hmm. And that's not why I got into photography. I got into photography because I loved creating something for myself.
Well, in high school, it was a great way to meet girls.
It is a great way to meet girls.
But that only lasts so long. I had 2 shows before the pandemic shut most of Springfield down. I had a show at Coffee Ethic. Big shout out to Michelle Bilionis for giving me a break. And my first show was at Pagination Bookshop. And also a big shout out to Jennifer Mervin and her great crew. And it was really rewarding because they were all new photographs. I didn't show anything that was older than 3 or 4 years at either one, I think. And they were very personal. And at the show at Pagination, we had one night where I did sort of a Q&A with Sonny Hocklander, who used to be the arts editor at the Springfield News Leader. So we sort of talked in advance about what are we going to talk about. And I had to come up with what are my photos about. And at the time, what I said was that I like to take photographs that the beauty of presence without the presence of beauty, or words to that effect. When I go out, I like to find signs that people were there, but without having people in the picture. And a lot of my work is devoid of people. When I start taking pictures of people, it's a different mindset. But when they're for me, I try to make really quiet photos in very natural settings.
I noticed that you throw a lot of those. You kind of have those. There was one of a sock.
Yeah. It's
is that kind of the.
Actually, I just remember the phrase that I used was the beauty of abandonment and the abandonment of beauty. And the beauty of abandonment is something like the sock, the sock or the glove or the mitten that just accidentally falls out of the kid's stroller or out of the, the grown-up's, pocket or whatever. And just lands in such a way that, particularly on asphalt or concrete, there's a textural thing that becomes beautiful to me. But it also says that people were here. So that's the beauty of abandonment. The abandonment of beauty is when something like a barn or a car starts to return to being something other than what it was. The ashes to ashes thing.
Like the second law of thermodynamics.
I'll trust you on that one. Yeah, because I've never even begun to play a physicist on television.
I think it is, as time progresses, things degrade. I think that's what it is.
And that's great for me to know. I'll keep that in mind. I'm gonna make that my new motto. I'm looking for time progressing and things degrading, which really, but it is. That's spot on. When I moved here, I was looking around for the photo community, and one of the things I noticed was that there are a lot of good photographers here who take the exact same photograph, and I didn't want to be the photographer who took another picture of a field full of sunflowers. There are already people who do that really, really well.
Yeah, they've licked that one. Yeah,
they've got that one, and I just am not going to be able to do it any better. So I was looking for my version of a field of sunflowers. You hope, when you have a show, you hope that people are going to buy it. And then you realize that either you've got a pretty lofty impression of your skills or your value, the value of your work, or this is a really bad place to try to sell art. And
right.
I prefer to think that it's the second. It's a tough market. And everybody I've talked to, whether they're painters or sculptors or whatever, because there is a lot of talent in this town. Every now and then I have to remember that there's nearly 250,000 people when you take into the surrounding towns who live in the Springfield area for 225,000, something like that.
Actually, Springfield's moved up to number 2 in the state of Missouri. Yeah, as far as population.
Burlington, Vermont, where I grew up, population is 45,000.
I do notice that you do a lot of wildlife and plants and flowers. Is that just a kind of a guilty pleasure photography for you? Therapeutic, I guess?
Yeah, all of the above. It's for lack of anything else to take a picture of. Donnell does beautiful landscaping around the yard, and I want to be able to say this is what it looked like when we moved in 2019, and this is what it looked like in 2025. I've got a record of our place in DC that's like that, where you can see over 20 years what happened, and we're trying to do that in 5 here. Then but the plants are a challenge, and it's similar to the sunflower thing, where everybody takes pictures of the daffodils when they bloom, and the crocus and the tulips and all that sort of stuff. So how do you do it different? That's the challenge for me, is how do you take that picture in a different way? And sometimes it's like macro, get as close as you possibly can, most of the time. And then there's the light thing that we began the conversation with, which is try to find unique light. The wildlife thing, primarily birds, because our backyard somehow has become like this, airport for, migrating birds. And they're in our neighbor's backyard, the neighbors behind us. There's this enormous shingle oak where there are 2 red-shouldered hawks that are nesting, and I've been following them since they moved into the neighborhood and
Oh,
began
that's
building
cool.
their nest. Yeah, it's been, I mean, saw the mating process. Feel sorry for her.
Did you document it?
I did, and I published it, and people just thought it was wonderful. But you know, more fun has been the hunting gathering part of it, because I've got a series of photos that I'm having a hard time editing right now of the male just tearing up I think it was a cackle, and bringing home snakes and frogs and even a chub, which is a type of fish that Bo Brown, who you probably know, Bo, of course, was able to say, "Oh yeah, well that's a chub." And this is, yeah. Anyway, you know, sort of like this little documentation of this little bird family, you know, and hopefully they will have hatchlings soon. The nest is so high, it'll take a while before I'll be able to see them. So that's both a challenge, and I like sharing those photos. I mean, you know, Facebook, I published one the other day, and I think I got like 400 likes. That's not circulation 2 million, but on Facebook, that's not bad for a guy, you know, taking pictures in his backyard, you know.
Now, do you have an official, like
a website?
an official Facebook page, or is it just Friends of Jym Wilson?
Yeah,
page?
it's my personal page. Now with the bird photos, and some of the plant photos, I will share those to like my neighborhood association page, the Missouri Birders page for the bird stuff. But I am completely technically incompetent when it comes to website stuff. It's just, you know, it's the Larson cartoon. It's blah, 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 walk, blah, 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 Fido, blah, 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 food. You know, that's me trying to figure out how to build a website. I just don't get it. Everybody talked about all the things they were going to do during the pandemic. And, you know, I think I binge watched West Wing for the 4th or 5th time. You know, that got me through a couple of weeks.
Sorkin's great.
Yeah, exactly. Sorkin's a genius. And yeah.
So what is on the horizon? Because you said, you know, your work with Carbon Trace, you guys have some stuff with that, but what are maybe some of more your personal projects that you're looking at that you would like to accomplish coming up here?
Yeah. Well, last year, because of the pandemic, I didn't feel comfortable exploring Missouri. And that certainly is important. You know, it's a big state. It's a beautiful state. And it's got a lot of rural portions of it that I want to see. So get out there and see that. Every now and then I get a wild hair and pull out old negatives and just start looking through that stuff for things to scan. Because when I was shooting film, you were making prints, and now I can scan it and do things that I could have never done in the darkroom. So I like putting that stuff together. I sort of like the idea of building an archive of my career while continuing to make new work. You know, people, I think the second most common question that good photographers ever get asked is, why don't you do a book? The first one being, you must have a really good camera. What type of camera do you use? Mm-hmm. To which you always respond, I also make really good cookies. You should see my stove. But anyway, you know, to the question of, have you ever thought about doing a book? I always say, go to Barnes & Noble, go to the remainder section. Tell me what the most remaindered books are. There's a book on the shelf over there by Irving Penn that was his life retrospective, one of the greatest photographers of his time period. Came out, it was like $125. I bought it for $4. Remaindered at Barnes & Noble's. It's just, you know, if you do, you know, you can put a book together on Shutterfly and have 100 copies made and sell those to your friends at cost. And that's wonderful. I like the idea of any project I do with Carbon Trace having a still photograph component to it, both to document it for Carbon Trace, to document it for myself, and potentially as a fundraiser, you know, for Carbon Trace. All I ever want to do with those things is break even. I do typically at the end of the year try to choose my favorite 50 to 75 photographs, and I'll do a little book out of that. And out of that, I try to choose my absolute favorite photo. Now that things are opening up a little bit more, I'd like to try to do some more shows because I was sort of starting to get the hang of that. It's a little pricey because you got to have prints made, you got to get them framed, and and I learned from my mistakes, but I haven't had a chance to apply those lessons from the first two shows.
How important is it to you to print your work as a photographer?
To print it myself?
Just to have it printed, you know?
That's an excellent question, because the answer is very and not at all. It's very important because it's still that tangible thing. It's different to hold a print than it is to look at it on a monitor. I mean, there's a nice monitor sitting right there. It's good size. And then, you turn around and you look at that print that's 3 feet wide, and it's a little bit.
That one's better.
Yeah, it's a whole lot better than seeing it.
And I'm pointing to the is that a panorama?
It's a panorama.
Yeah, it's a panorama.
And it was shot on an iPhone. And that's a thing that we can talk about. I do a huge amount of my personal work on iPhones. Because it's not an iPhone, it's an iCamera. When I buy a new iPhone, I didn't get a new phone, I got a new camera. And I have had some fun tweaking people who are totally into, you can't take a good photograph with a phone. I mean, yeah, it's nice, but it's not art.
You can't blow it up very big either.
Yeah, no, you can't, because that one's only about 2.5 feet wide. With a real camera, you could have made it at least 3 feet wide. But the new iPhone, the iPhone 12 Pro Max, is stunning. The photo that I've taken this year that has received the most comments since I posted it online, iPhone 12, and people just don't believe it.
Oh, it is. It's absolutely the coolest camera I have. I mean, I hate to say it, and you go spend money on all these, like these other cameras and stuff. You're like, this is actually the best one.
Well, the best camera is the camera you've got with you.
It's the one you've got with you.
Right. Yeah. It's that simple. But to go back to your original question, how important is it to print? I love printing. Unfortunately, I've got boxes full of my prints, and I have no idea, and some of them are already in frame. Some of them I'd love to have framed. You run out of wall space. You kind of like to have a little bit of, it's like, is it going to be like the Louvre where they stack stuff 4 frames high and there's, maybe a foot between or a couple of inches between or is it going to be like, here's a wall, here's a photograph, or do you rotate your work? It's just, it gets a little bit crazy, but I do love getting something printed really big. In fact, Mark Shipley, the owner of 417 PhotoWorks, just left me a message saying, hey, I've got a test print for you to look at. And it's of the photo that's received the most comments, the iPhone photo.
Really?
Yeah. It's a photograph of a poppy and and he and I, it's great. One of the things that's great about having your work printed is if you have it printed at a real shop, as opposed to taking it to Walmart or whatever, is developing a relationship with the printer. So you can talk about different paper surfaces, size, ask him to do a little color correction. Mark has helped me get to the point where I'm very confident when I give him a file that it's going to look the way it looked on my screen.
Well, that is really good to know, because I was called out, was it 3 or 4 days ago by the wife. And she was like, you need to get some of your prints put up in the house because it's time. We've got the new house. We've got tons of wall space now, and it's high time that I hang some stuff up.
Yeah. And in this room, I think two of the photos are mine that are on the walls. Everything else was taken by somebody else. Some of them were purchases from people I don't know, and some of them were gifts from people I do know, and some of them were purchases from people I do know. But they all are special photos to me. So then, I've got that, and then I've got the little stack of books that I've done on my own work once a year for the last couple of years. The other thing, like I said, developing a relationship with a printer, equally important to me is developing a relationship with a camera store. I'm all about brick and mortar. When I learned about...
It's so much better.
When I learned about the local shop here, Bedford Camera and Video, when I learned about them...
That's where I bought this
one.
Yeah.
I mean, you go in, you develop a relationship with Mary Lou, with Jim, with Isaac, with Sam, et cetera, et cetera. You can go in and say, I want to do this. What should I buy? Or... It's just so much different than going on Amazon and just saying, I want this, and then it shows up and you have no idea how to
and it's the tangible. You can look at a camera on Amazon, but until you pick it up, and like this, I had a specific purpose, and I go, okay, I'm going to put this lens on top of this. I'm going to see how it feels. I want to see the weight of it. I want to see how it moves. Yeah. Because it is a tool, and sometimes you leave it to a lot to chance by buying it off of online, and then all of a sudden you're like, this doesn't feel good.
Yeah, for something that's two-dimensional, the tool is very tactile.
Yeah.
Photography, ultimately it's going to be a flat print or a screen. But the tool itself, I mean, it's like you wouldn't buy a drill that didn't feel comfortable in your hand. You wouldn't buy a camera that didn't feel comfortable in your hand. And going someplace where they know your work, they know you can rent stuff and try it out. It's just makes all the difference in the world.
Oh, yeah.
And, to just send the plug a little bit further, it's like going to a local bookstore or a local clothing store, as opposed to going to Jeff Bezos' behemoth. You might pay a little bit more in taxes, not so much anymore, thanks to the laws in various states. But you're helping, you're putting food on the table of your friends.
Oh yeah.
You're supporting the local economy.
Well, and you're also, and that's, that is the thing, is you are, you're supporting the people that you know, or that you can know. Mm-hmm. And by walking into their shop, you have a lot better chance of knowing them than whoever is packing your box in Dallas, Texas, or wherever. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, now they're packing boxes, not far from here.
That's true. Yeah. That might run out. We might, that argument may run out a little bit here pretty soon.
Yeah. Depends. I mean, I'm happy to buy, cornflakes from them, but
yeah,
I don't know.
No, I agree. I agree.
I would. Yeah. So
that was kind of the mystique too. And I know that's kind of sad, but I remember, growing up, having the camera shop in the town that I grew up in. You always went in, they were looking at your prints. They kind of had a connection with you because they were looking at your prints, and they were going, oh yeah, this one photo of yours turned out really good. And you're like, oh, which one? You couldn't wait to look at it. And they're like, oh yeah, we love this one. And they go, hey, can we make a print of this and hang it up in the shop? That was always fun.
Yeah.
That was always that was like before Facebook though. That was your way of posting it and having a little gallery out there. And it was always kind of neat.
Yeah. As I said earlier, the first photo related job that I had was at a department store, a small family owned department store. And amazingly, we had a fantastic photo department because the manager's son was a very good photographer. And I learned so much about photography selling cameras and selling darkroom equipment because I had to teach somebody else. So it was reinforcing what I knew. And then when I went to a single purpose photo store, we had more professional customers. So you pick their brains a little bit.
Yeah.
And, and after that I was, off on my thing with the local paper.
I hate to ask this question, but
Sure.
I'm just going to go ahead and ask. Do you typically shoot manual?
I do. I for a while was using program a lot. And in a situation where things might be changing quickly, I might switch back to program. But for example, the birds, the hawks, are very high up in a tree and in deep shadow. The meter will not understand what's going on, whether it's on program or automatic or whatever. It's going to it's actually going to overexpose it because it sees all that dark and it wants to make it lighter. Backtrack just a minute. Because most cameras now have screens on the back, you can take a test photo and see what your settings are giving you for results. And then do I need to lower my shutter speed, open up my aperture, some combination of both, go the other way, whatever. But I do try to. Now, back in the day of film, you could walk into a room and look around and know what the exposure was or come very, very close in your head because just, it was Tri-X. It was, black and white Tri-X ASA 400. Bright sunny day, it's 1008.
Yeah.
And you go from there. Or I'm in this crappy gym with no light and it's going to be Tri-X push to 1600 and pray.
Right.
So, yeah. But shooting manual is the best way for beginning photographers to learn how stuff works, the effect that all of those little controls have. And also take the camera off of continuous high-speed motor drive and set it on single, for God's sake. And think about each picture that you're taking. Now, again, the birds, continuous high speed, and I'll put the hand grip on that's going to add another couple of frames per second because that stuff happens fast. But if I'm out it's like the phone doesn't really have a motor drive. See,
Right.
the phone camera doesn't have a motor drive on it, and there are apps that you can get that allow you to control the exposure on phones. Again, going to my inability to create a website, I haven't done a whole lot with that stuff, but it is, it's intriguing to me to be able to control the phone.
When I worked I became somewhat of a photo editor because I was the only one that knew how to shoot photos. So I was the photo editor, but I had interns that worked for me at a university. And I remember for a while there, because I was so busy, I had so many of them coming into and they would bring in just 500 junk images. And I would have to go and sift through all 500 of those junk images. I'm like, listen, guys, I don't have time to go through all these. And so I went and bought some like 100 or 512 megabyte cards. And I said, here, take this. And they're like, there's only like room for 30 images on that. I said, that's what I want.
Yeah.
I said, so start composing your shots and quit firing off a million of them on there, because
that's a brilliant solution. That's a brilliant solution. When I was a photo editor and cards started getting bigger and having greater capacity, I developed the philosophy that the only thing more dangerous than a photographer with a 64 gigabyte card was a photographer with a 128 gigabyte card.
Yeah.
Because it's just like, they're going to just put the hammer down and let you, so it's like, all right, I'm putting my name underneath your photo from now on.
Right.
Because I'm the one that's actually taking it. You're just sending me a bunch of raw material.
Right. You're just aiming the camera and pushing the button. Yeah.
That was one of the times when I would have a brotherly fight with my colleague. I told him that one time, and he then proceeded to send like 3 photos from every performance from an award show for like the first shipment of discs. I was like, okay, take it back. You win.
Well, and and that the less is more has helped me a lot of times, because like I like having one lens. I like setting myself a goal and saying I'm not shooting more than 30 images, so I need to start composing stuff a little bit more. It's kind of going back to my film days and enjoying it a little bit.
Yeah, one of the lessons that sometimes is given to people who are just getting started, or if you're looking to reboot your way of seeing, is go out with just one lens and make it a prime lens, not a zoom lens. And a prime lens is a fixed focal length, either like a 28 or a 35 or a 50 is what people usually say. Go out with a wide angle to normal angle lens and just work with that,
And you'll be so glad you did.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's when the plane flying overhead will do barrel rolls, and you'll really wonder where your 300 millimeter. It's like,
that is so funny how that happens. Sometimes you'll be sitting there going, oh wow, the bald eagle just landed in the tree over there. Oh, too bad I've got a 24 mil.
Yeah,
it's not going to get it.
Yeah. There are any photographer can tell stories about the photos they didn't take, and photojournalists in some ways it's more painful.
Yeah,
the photos that got away. That could have been my award winner. Award winning. I have a very different philosophy about awards, and that is that primarily most awards are just the lead to your obituary. It's true. Academy Award winning actor Sean Penn died yesterday. It's going to be the lead to his obituary. It's not going to be Sean Penn philanthropist, Sean Penn jerk.
That's true.
It's going to be Academy Award.
That is true.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with journalism. Pulitzer Prize winning photographer, so and so.
Wow.
Now, had I ever won a Pulitzer Prize, I would have a whole different take on it.
You'd be like, kill me.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm ready to have my obituary is done, or at least the lead.
So with Carbon Trace has got some of the projects coming down the chute, but now you have taken a very cinematographer kind of angle on the most recent projects. Talk about the transition from photography into cinematography, and what is that journey like for you right now? Because it's different.
Oh man, you made it like an hour and a half without using the word journey. And
oh yeah.
Oh well. Okay, so the transition from still photographs to video for me is a challenge because of two things. Motion equaling the need to be constantly aware of focus, and audio. Those
Audio sucks.
Those are the two biggest obstacles for me. On the other hand, it still comes down to composition and light. So if I can nail those two things fairly quickly in the process of shooting a scene, I can then turn my attention a little bit more to focus and audio. And fortunately, most of the projects that I work on, the audio, my responsibility for audio is an on-camera little Rode mic plugged into the side, and it's there just to help sync up.
Like scratch audio, yeah.
Yeah, it's there to sync with the real audio that's being recorded with, digitally. Focus is a bear because, as you and Sam were talking about the other day, the director of photography for Land of Milk and Honey, everybody wants to shoot at 2.8.
Yeah.
Well, that's great if you're indoors. But the minute you step outside and you're shooting at a 30th of a second, which is it's sort of the equivalent of the shutter speed for cinematography or for video, 30th of a second at 2.8 at ISO 100 on a bright sunny day just is not going to work.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you're stopping down and you're getting weird depth of field things and stuff like that.
Well, and you've got such a thin margin, a very
hard.
small margin of error there when you're doing it.
Yeah. But the very first project that I worked on was a student project. It was called Songs from the Street. It's a lovely documentary that was...
I saw the photos for that.
Yeah.
Those are really good.
Yeah, thanks. Because, once again, there I am on set, supposed to be, camera B or camera C, and I'm making stills because it's just like, this is a homeless street choir. This is just too good for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit, sometimes I can be a little bit, I don't want to say dismissive, but it's just like, man, this is too good for video. This has got to be a still photograph.
You're right, though. I mean, slicing life into one image, there's just some things that it, and I keep looking at these 3 images that you have behind. Those would be great videos. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. But the slices that were taken there, they tell a better story than seeing the video sometimes.
Yeah, the best example I can think of is there's a very famous photo from Saigon during the Vietnam War taken by Eddie Adams of a police captain executing a prisoner in the streets. Yeah. And it was a photograph that won a Pulitzer, securing Eddie's lead to his obituary. But more importantly, caused such an outrage here in the States that it really helped move the anti-war movement forward. So I say that photo, that photo.
Oh, yeah.
It's the gun to the head.
Mm-hmm.
It's the guy grimacing as the bullet is entering his brain or whatever. There's video of that.
Yeah.
Most people have never seen it.
Yeah.
And when you see it, it's stunning that Eddie got that picture because it's so fast. It's like hand up, pull trigger, hand down. Yeah. I mean, it's probably less than a couple of seconds. So still photographs, boom. But to circle back from my digression to Songs from the Street, I was really lucky because I was working with a lot of students who just sort of said, oh yeah, if you can go over there and just get us some B-roll. And so I could do that. I could go over and sort of practice. What's working for me? I'm not steady enough to hand hold. I got to go onto a tripod most of the time. I like working with a really long lens, even though it's counterintuitive to what everybody else is doing. Because that way I'm shooting these really tight faces, and suddenly, all of a sudden, I'm getting, at performances, I'm getting the audience crying, or I'm just getting these really intimate moments between members of the choir. And when I watched that film for the first time and saw what of mine had been cut in, that was very, very rewarding. And I would like to think also that my work with the students was helpful to them in terms of like trying to bring some journalistic ethics to it, because during my years in journalism, I had ethical lessons, journalistic ethics lessons pounded into my head, and then in some ways became an authority within USA Today on the ethics of photojournalism. So when I work with the students, I try to do that same thing. No, you can't set that up. No, you can't ask them to do that again.
Right.
This is a documentary. This is real life. You're not making a fictional film. And hopefully they will, go forward with that information and at least keep it in the back of their mind. And
that's a fine line too, because when people know that you're going to be there, invariably sometimes they'll set it up and you're like, we don't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, that was one of the big arguments about bringing cameras into the courtroom. I mean, it's a different way of looking at this, but one of the arguments was that lawyers would start performing for cameras.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court still won't allow cameras in the courtroom for that very reason.
And it's very good that they don't, in my opinion.
And we could talk about that some other time.
We can leave the sketch artists in there. Yeah.
But Carbon Trace is, we're small but scrappy. And there is a core group of 4, including myself, who do what we call the professional level work. And there are 2 people, only 2 of us, 2 of that core group are staff. The other 2 of us are volunteers. But it's sort of amazing to me the amount of projects that Carbon Trace has in the works, between just finishing Songs from the Street to a project called 16 Weeks that is student produced that has to do with being a student at MSU during the pandemic. It just is a fascinating look at that.
And I'll post some of that stuff in the comments so people can see those.
Yeah. You know, the trailers are all on YouTube. Our YouTube channel gets a lot of our material out there, at least in trailer form, and there are a couple of full films on the YouTube channel. We'd love to have people subscribe to that, and just because it's a great way to stay in touch with what we're doing. There's cool stuff there. Andy Klein, who was the founder of Carbon Trace, has just begun a new series that the first the basic theme of it is what I learned watching documentary films, and it is going to be hopefully a little bit participatory. I mean, you know, in the comment field, but it's going to be Andy doing what he does best, talking about documentary films and talking about filmmaking.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a good project. The first one just went up last week, and I saw a couple of test versions of it, and it's definitely improved. He had a technique that I loved that he abandoned, but that's okay. It's his project. But the first installment is very much an introduction. So the second installment, which should be going up either this week or early next week, will probably be a better taste of what they'll be like each week.
Oh, that'll be neat.
Yeah. And we're also doing, on the YouTube channel, we are doing interviews with our volunteers, with our interns. I'm going to be interviewed sometime fairly soon. And that's just ways for people to become familiar with both the people involved with Carbon Trace and the various projects that we're working on.
So you all have got a ton. I went out and looked at kind of all the projects that you all have got in the works and that you've got under your belt and are kind of in post-production now. Is that right?
There are a couple that are in post-production. There's one that, on one hand, it'd be great to just finish it. On the other hand, it'd be great to, well, actually, there are 2 that are in this category. It'd be great to make one more visit, but there's some travel involved. So that's been tricky for the last year. And, and now that that's opened up a little bit more, it's about timing and funding. But, I mean, I am still getting familiar with all the different projects that we're doing. And then, you know, there's the sort of work for hire stuff that we do to pay for. You know, I'm the president of the board, and my motto is sort of like taking the non out of nonprofit. You know, I really would love for us to be able to fund our own projects and still keep that 501(c) rating, just so that we're not, you know, we will always be scrambling. We will always be looking for money. That's the way small startups work. That's the way, you know, small companies work. And I've been saying, you know, either we get this grant or we have the biggest, longest lasting bake sale ever.
It's a great idea.
Yeah. Because as I said earlier, I've got a great stove and I make really good cookies.
So do you have any projects out there film-wise that you're working on or that you're thinking of working on? I mean, now that you've kind of got into this foray of motion film, has it spurred any creativity outside of that?
I actually made one movie in high school and somehow got off the track of it. And then I had another opportunity when video came to newspapers, and I turned it over to somebody else. So now this is like, I've always loved going to the movies. Been watching movies since I was a little kid, and after I left USA Today, I finally wrote a script that I had been saying I was going to write for nearly 20 years, and I found some partners who primarily guided me. I was the lead writer. It needs a rewrite, so that would be wonderful. That's a full blown, this would be 2 hours worth of movie making and would require real money. Then I've got like a little documentary that's just silly and fun, and it's about, I don't want to give it all away, but it's about mowing your lawn. And
Okay.
and Missouri's obsession with mowing your lawn.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
They are.
They are.
And when that person over there decides to mow their yard, then that person hears it and they go, honey, I got to get out and mow the grass today because they're going to pay attention, you know.
It's the state sport. You know, never mind hunting, never mind fishing. Mowing your lawn is the state sport in Missouri.
You can always move out to Fordland.
Yeah.
We don't care out there.
Yeah. Well, that's our goal here. You know, as I said earlier, you know, over the course of 20 years in DC, we managed to get to the point where even though we had a good sized lot for our house, we had no grass left. Everything was in plantings, and that's the goal here, particularly in the front. Now, it's going to be a while, but that is the goal, is to never have to mow and hopefully that'll be done in 3 years. Even if it means just like mountains of mulch, just to not have to mow would be wonderful.
Mulch is a beautiful thing.
Mulch is a beautiful thing. So anyway, a little documentary on mowing that would be like 7 to 12, 15 minutes at the very, very most is a fun idea. I do have a treatment for what has been. I was told by a script writing instructor that it really needed to be a one-off miniseries, you know, one of those like 12 episode type of things.
Yeah.
I've got a treatment for that. I've had one discussion with somebody about it, but it hasn't gone anywhere yet. It was initially set in North Carolina, and then I moved to Springfield, and I said, well, this works here too. So, you know, if anybody wants to talk about a motion picture or a series idea, I'm happy to have that conversation. So, you know, lots of stuff.
Have you ever tried Sato?
Have I ever tried Sato? I have not.
That would be a great, great experience for you.
Okay.
You won't like it. But when it's over with, you'll absolutely love it.
Okay. First, I have to find out what Sato is.
Sato 48? You haven't heard of Sato 48?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm not hip to the lingo. Yeah. There's a filmmaker who I have yet to meet in person. His name is James Heron.
Yes.
Is it Heron or Heron?
Heron.
Heron is one of the most intriguing guys that I have never met face to face who lives in this area, and he has participated for several years, and he's very good. And I know that he participated this year, which was just a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I am very intrigued with that whole idea.
Yeah.
We talked about doing it with Carbon Trace. I know Carbon Trace has tried it, but because we don't deal in fiction, it's not really in our wheelhouse. But I have a feeling that, you know, if we talked it up enough and had a crew ready to roll and ready to work for 72 hours, that
48.
48.
Yeah.
That we, well, you know.
Yeah.
48 always becomes 72.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It does.
I just celebrate.
Especially if you're James Heron.
Yeah.
James, if you're listening, I think it took him close to 72 to get his done.
Yeah. You know, but, you know, that goes right back to the whole big project thing for me. I love organizing big projects, you know, making sure that everybody's got the tools that they need to succeed. One of my mentors was the deputy managing photo editor for photography at USA Today, and his name is Frank Falwell. And Frank had one of those slogans, which was, when we plan, we succeed. And you know, it's very basic. It's very simple. You can probably buy it at Office Depot as a wall hanging, but he was completely right. Every time that I planned, I succeeded. And success is money in the bank. Every time you succeed, you can say to the people who let you do something or who approved a project or whatever, you can say, that's money in the bank. That's money in the bank. The next time I come to you, I'm spending that money.
It's amazing to me how many people like to skip that step.
So it was just the 40th anniversary, 30th anniversary of a project I did in Burlington at the Free Press called 24 Hours in Burlington, Vermont. And this was back when 24 Hours in the USA was a big deal. You know, there were these 24 hours in a project where they would dispatch 100 photographers across the country, or, you know, 500 photographers, whatever. So we did 24 Hours in Burlington, and there were 4 of us. But the planning that went into it was 6 weeks, and we had, along one wall in the photo department, we had a roll of newsprint, and we had just marked off all the hours and then 4 lines and what each person would be doing every hour. And we all worked 24 hours, and it was just a blast. It was just so much fun. I would love to do it again, and at the same time, I would hate to do it again, because if we did it again, people would be like, okay, you've got a blog, and you've got a tweet, and you've got to shoot video, and we're going to go live, as you're doing it. It's just, there would be no like time to look at the film and think about it, make
Right.
good prints and stuff like that. And that's
Well, and that's a great point, because now what we do is we expect to be amazing at photography or at filmmaking or anything like that, but we segment so much of our time that we don't dedicate to actually, taking a photograph. We're like, oh, part of the photographic process now is take the photograph, let's do a quick edit on it, and let's upload it to Facebook. And the reality of it is we spent enough time actually composing our image and spending time to, go out and like look at what we're going to go shoot photographs of ahead of time, and actually took the time to plan those shots and set it all up. Because a lot of that is planning, it isn't just waking up in the morning and running out to a location and go, oh, there's going to be a flower that pops up here and I'm going to go and shoot it. I mean, it's knowing what time of day, what the weather's going to be like. It's going to be overcast. There's so much that goes into it.
Yep.
And we kind of skip over, even as photographers or as filmmakers, we skip over that step that the average person doesn't know what goes into actually creating something like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The other side of that coin is that with all of the different mediums to deliver information now, with Facebook, with Twitter, with Instagram, there's an expectation of immediacy. One of my favorite projects ever in Burlington was 3 weeks in the Soviet Union with a group of kids from Vermont who were going to circus camp. And they trained in Moscow for a week while the reporter...
I watched this.
Yeah. So they trained in Moscow for a week while the reporter and I went to Yaroslavl, which was Burlington's sister city, and we reported on the sister city relationship. Then the kids joined us, performed on Yaroslavl, and then we all went to the Black Sea. In those 3 weeks, I called back to the office one time. There was no expectation of anything. We didn't publish for nearly a month after we got back. There was no expectation of us to, file every day that the kids from, Vermont were performing in Moscow today, attended the circus today. There was none of that. I mean, it's just like...
So you could be totally immersed in that subject, and you could actually live within that subject, and you didn't have to go, oh wait, I've got a deadline. You can, your deadline is your time frame is where you're at, which would be so awesome.
It was awesome.
To do.
all while shooting film, transparency film, which was like its own little nightmare. Cause I think about the other piece of
like
that
slide film.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So, and now that, on the other hand, if I was to go shoot that now, if there was the expectation of filing immediately, I would be shooting with much better cameras, using digital, using very easy color correction techniques and stuff like
Slide
that.
film was a little more finicky as far as getting exposure, correct?
Very finicky.
But you had a lot more latitude in post, correct, with slide film?
No. I mean, color negative film and color and black and white negative film allow you to make some mistakes. If you make mistakes with transparency film, it's forever. It's just sort of gone. Although I did scan some of those old photos earlier this year, end of last year, and was able to do a lot of color correction. But the problem with transparency film is if you're underexposed, it's just going to be really, really dark. If you're overexposed, it's just blown out. The highlights are gone and things look really, really weird. And it's really finicky when it comes to the type of light. Fluorescent light and slide film do not play well together at all. They don't get along.
Well, Jim, I could literally sit and talk to you all day about this, but I have to ask one question, because we live in a digital world right now. Mm-hmm. Digital or negative? And what is the difference between the two? You've been doing this long enough. I have never been able to figure it out, but I love photograph negatives. I love the feel and the look of it better.
Film, as we discussed earlier, the most is 36 exposures on a roll. If you're shooting with 2 1/4, it's either 12 or 24 exposures on a roll. Usually 12. If you blow through 36 pictures in 5 minutes, you have to stop and change, and chances are you probably really haven't, done anything with the majority of those photos. So film requires a much more thoughtful approach. 95% of the time. The other 5% of the time are the times when something highly unusual is coming on. But film, you slow down, you watch things, you wait for things. Digital, you can afford to sort of spray, point and spray. So that's the big plus for film, is it's a more thoughtful medium usually. You can incorporate that into digital. You can be thoughtful. There's absolutely no reason that you can't shoot 36 photos over the course of one day if you tell yourself, I'm going to take one picture, of this situation. Probably 1978, 79, 1980. Every morning I would have breakfast with a group of friends who were photographers and videographers. And we would have breakfast at a diner, and we would talk about what we did the night before, what we shot, how we, what type of gear we used, what was published, what we thought we were going to be doing that day. One guy was shooting for the local TV station, one guy was shooting for the alternative weekly, and I was shooting for the local daily. We all had very different approaches to things, but we all sort of had the same fantasy, and that was technological advances that would make it easier for us to make good images, great images. And that's what digital does allow you to do that film doesn't allow for. That's not to belittle any of the work that was ever done on film, but the capabilities now with digital are just mind-blowing. We can finally do the things that we dreamed about, that we fantasized about. The only thing that remains to be done is the ability to blink your eyes and capture a moment and download the photo from the port that's in the back of your neck. That's the only thing that we can't do yet.
And God help us if it does happen that way.
Yeah. But your question is it's a fun one that you can debate both sides of forever.
Sure.
Ansel Adams, the great landscape photographer, loved Polaroid cameras, and he used to dry his work prints in a microwave. That's just to say, photographers embrace technology. Oh, yeah. We work in a technical medium. Whether it's a digital camera or a mechanical camera, you're still tripping. You're still, as Sam put it, we're pushing buttons. It's to me, one of the best things I've ever heard anybody say about photographers was written by Susan Sontag in her book On Photography. And she said, photographers are all 5-year-olds running around pointing and saying, look at what I see.
That is awesome. It's the truth, though. Yeah. I do. It's weird because I can walk out in the woods and I'll be constantly amazed at something. And it really is. It doesn't really change. Yeah. It's been the same. Yeah.
The hard part is to make yourself occasionally put the camera down. There's another tremendous photographer named Michael Williamson, who is one of the Washington Post senior guys. And he basically travels the country doing, it feels like whatever he wants to do. I know that there are editors sending him places, but he was saying that, some woman came up to him. He was at a flower show and he was taking lots and lots of photos. And she said to him, young man, and Michael's like older than me, but, young man, if you just put that camera down, you'd appreciate this a whole lot more. And he tried to explain to her that sometimes photographers cannot appreciate things without taking pictures of them. It's kind of sad, and it's
a collection.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard for me to go to concerts, to musical performances, and not take pictures, because so much of my early work involved music, and it took me a long time to get over that. To just sort of say, just be part of the moment. Tomorrow you can take a picture, and maybe that picture will be informed by this moment that you're appreciating without the camera.
Yeah, it ebbs and flows with me, and it has a lot. I mean, I can remember for certain portions of my life that's all I had on my hand was a camera, and I was shooting photographs of every event that I was at or that I was doing. And then there are times whenever I just decide that I can't remember. I think it was Ansel Adams that said if you were taking a picture of it, you missed that portion of your life, or something along those lines.
Yeah,
that's a bad quote, but it is the truth, because you really don't experience the true aspect of life if you're always behind a lens.
Did I see that baby being born?
Right.
Yeah, I photographed a couple of births for friends, and I know I saw that baby being born, but it helps to see the photos to remind me what it felt like. That's a bad example. That's among the most amazing experiences I've ever had, is photographing a birth. You are trying to preserve not only your own life, but the life that you witness. And there's a very fine line between those two things.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do hold a responsibility that we are a documenter. We're documenting what this life is like, and we out of joy we've taken that mantle to do it. Now there are some people that do it fictitiously.
Yeah.
and
that's good. It's all good. But I know that I can point to several events that I covered, that I was making photographs that were important photographs to share with a large audience, where at the same time I was able to sort of step outside for myself for just a second and say, this is one of the best moments of my life. I mean, I can pinpoint one in particular where I can say that was one of the best moments of my life, because it was and I was there to take a picture.
Really?
Yeah.
What was it?
I was in a small village in India, a village of the Dalit, who used to be called the Untouchables, but essentially one of the lower castes, and the caste system in theory no longer exists in India. And we had been taken to this village to meet these folks, and it was for a package of stories on women's health issues and AIDS, but primarily women's health issues. And we had been shown around this little village of maybe 35 or 40 small huts, and then all the women took us down to the edge of a river to tell us about their experiences with healthcare. And there was essentially a medicine woman in the village. So she talked a fair amount. There was no insurance, of course. And there were two men. There was me and there was our interpreter. And, river behind us, field on the other side with, insects chirping and stuff like that. And I just thought, I'm just incredibly lucky and fortunate at this moment to be allowed into this by these people who are being so open and so honest. And I'm making good pictures that are going to help tell their story. It was a remarkable experience.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it really was. It really was. And that was a long time ago, but I can still remember it was like it was yesterday.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Well, Jim, we have been talking for 2 hours.
Yeah.
This may go down in history as the longest podcast that I've had.
You're going to edit it down to 45 minutes, I hope, my friend, because
no,
I would never want to listen to me talk for 2 hours.
I'll have to listen to it tonight. I'll see. Jim, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you for allowing me to come into your inner sanctum, fortress of solitude here, to actually sit and talk with you. And we'll probably talk a little bit after I hit the record button to pause this. But this has been a great experience. I am so excited to have gotten to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening to me talk.
You have been listening to the Bravo Creative Podcast. Analysis of your biometrics have been compiled and calculated. You are now a minuscule part of the collective. Enjoy the rest of your pitiful day.